This is the story of Martin Hayes, an elderly black man who boarded a first-class flight in Los Angeles, only to face unwarranted scrutiny from an airline manager. What happens next leaves everyone speechless. Martin Hayes was a well-dressed man in his late 60s, with neatly combed silver hair and a calm demeanor that exuded quiet confidence. Despite his unassuming nature, Martin had a presence that turned heads, though not always for the right reasons. He had spent decades working as a CEO in a prominent engineering firm and had recently retired, finally allowing himself time to travel the world. Today, he was heading to New York for a long-awaited vacation. At Los Angeles International Airport, the first-class lounge was bustling with travelers. Martin sipped on a cup of coffee, scanning the morning newspaper on his tablet. He had arrived early, as he always did, and patiently waited for boarding to begin. As the gate agent announced boarding for first class, Martin stood and walked toward the gate, pulling his sleek black carry-on bag behind him. The line moved swiftly, and he handed his boarding pass to the agent, who smiled and said, "Have a great flight, Mr. Hayes." Martin stepped into the plane's first-class cabin, a section filled with plush seats and polished finishes. He placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat, adjusting his blazer as he glanced out the window. Minutes later, a commotion near the front of the cabin caught his attention. A tall, middle-aged man wearing an airline manager's uniform was speaking to the flight attendants, his tone sharp. "I'm telling you, he doesn't belong here," the manager said, his voice loud enough for several passengers to hear. "Check his ticket again." Martin looked up as the manager approached him, his expression stern. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again," the manager demanded. Martin raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Is there a problem?" he asked, pulling his boarding pass from his pocket and handing it over. The manager snatched the ticket, his eyes scanning it quickly. "First class, huh?" he muttered, his tone dripping with doubt. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman whispered to her husband, "What's his problem?" The man's clearly in the right seat. Martin remained composed, his voice steady. "I assure you this is my seat. I purchased it weeks ago." The manager frowned, ignoring the murmurs from the passengers. "I need to verify this with the gate. Sit tight," he said, walking briskly toward the front of the plane. The flight attendant nearest to Martin gave him an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry about this, sir. He's new." Martin nodded politely. "No need to apologize. Let's see how this plays out." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as the manager returned, his expression unreadable. "Well, it looks like your ticket checks out," he said, though his tone lacked sincerity. "But I'll be keeping an eye on you." Martin's gaze didn't waver. "I'd appreciate it if you treated all passengers with respect," he said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the manager pause. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Passengers exchanged whispers, and Martin sat quietly, his composed demeanor masking the frustration simmering beneath the surface. What no one realized was that Martin Hayes wasn't just any first-class passenger. His true identity would soon come to light, and it would leave everyone, including the manager, stunned. The plane's engines roared to life as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. The first-class cabin was quiet, but the tension lingered like a heavy cloud. Martin Hayes sat upright in his seat, his hands resting on the armrests as he gazed out the window. Though his expression remained calm, he couldn't ignore the subtle stares and whispers from nearby passengers. The flight attendant passed through the aisle, offering drinks before takeoff. She stopped at Martin's seat, her smile warm and apologetic. "Would you care for something to drink, Mr. Hayes?" "A glass of water, please," Martin replied, his tone polite but distant. As the attendant moved to retrieve his drink, Martin noticed the airline manager standing near the galley, his arms crossed and eyes scanning the cabin. He seemed to be making a point of watching Martin, and it didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. One man leaned over to his wife, whispering, I don't get it. Why is he so fixated on him? The guy hasn't done anything wrong. The manager's behavior was growing more apparent with every passing minute. A younger passenger seated across the aisle gave Martin an encouraging nod, silently showing his support. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the manager returned to the first-class cabin under the guise of checking on passengers. He stopped at Martin's seat, his tone clipped. "Everything all right here, sir?" Martin met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I was fine until you decided to single me out." The manager frowned. "I'm simply doing my job, ensuring everyone in this cabin is where they're supposed to be." Martin raised an eyebrow. "And yet you've only spoken to me." The quiet murmur of passengers grew louder. A middle-aged woman in the row ahead turned in her seat. "This is ridiculous," she said. "He's clearly supposed to be here. Why don't you leave him alone?" Another passenger chimed in. "Exactly. You're harassing him for no reason. Sit down and let us enjoy the flight." The manager flushed, his confidence faltering as the passenger's disapproval grew. He mumbled something under his breath and retreated to the galley. The flight attendant returned with Martin's glass of water, her expression troubled. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. Please let me know if there's anything I can do." Martin gave her a small smile. "Thank you. You've been kind." Hours passed, and the tension in the cabin gradually eased. The passengers who had spoken up for Martin offered him friendly smiles, silently expressing their solidarity. But the real surprise was still to come. The flight neared its final descent into New York, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Before we do, I'd like to make a special acknowledgment. Among our passengers today is someone truly remarkable. Mr. Martin Hayes, thank you for flying with us." The cabin erupted into applause, the sound filling the space. The airline manager, standing near the galley, froze in place. Martin looked up, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't expected the announcement, but he knew exactly why it had been made. Mr. Hayes is not only a valued customer, but a distinguished leader in the engineering industry. His work has impacted countless lives, and we're honored to have him aboard. The applause grew louder, and passengers turned to look at Martin, their smiles wide and genuine. The airline manager's face turned pale as realization dawned on him. As the applause filled the cabin, Martin remained composed, offering a polite nod to the passengers around him. Despite the warmth of their support, he could feel the weight of the airline manager's lingering gaze. The man stood frozen near the galley, his face a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. The flight attendant approached Martin with a bright smile. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't realize we had someone so esteemed on board. Thank you for choosing to fly with us." Martin chuckled softly. "I'm just another passenger, but I appreciate the kind words." A passenger across the aisle leaned over. "Esteemed? What exactly do you do, sir?" Before Martin could answer, another voice joined the conversation. It was the airline manager, his tone defensive as he stepped closer. "Yes, I'd like to know as well. Clearly I've missed something important here." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers exchanging puzzled and irritated glances. The manager's attempt to reclaim authority wasn't going unnoticed. Martin sighed, placing his glass of water on the tray table. He adjusted his blazer before turning to face the manager directly. "Since you seem so interested, let me clarify. I'm Martin Hayes, former CEO of Hayes and Ellington Engineering, a firm responsible for building some of the most advanced airport infrastructures in the country, including the one in Los Angeles where you work." The cabin went silent. The weight of Martin's words seemed to hang in the air. Martin continued, his tone calm but pointed. "I've spent decades ensuring people like you have the tools and resources to do your jobs efficiently and fairly. I've also worked closely with airlines to improve passenger experiences, something I can see still needs work." The manager's face turned crimson, and he opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the cabin, realizing every passenger's eyes were on him. One of the passengers let out a low whistle. "Wow. talk about picking the wrong person to mess with. Another passenger added, maybe next time you'll think twice before judging someone based on appearances. The manager's shoulders sagged as he took a small step back. Mr. Hayes, I had no idea. I apologize if I offended you. Martin raised an eyebrow. You didn't just offend me. You disrespected a passenger who had every right to be here. Your actions set a poor example, not only for your colleagues but for the passengers who watched this unfold. The cabin murmurs grew louder, some passengers nodding in agreement. The flight attendant, standing nearby, placed a gentle hand on Martin's shoulder. Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the cabin crew, I'd like to sincerely apologize for how you were treated. This isn't the standard we hold ourselves to. Martin gave her a small smile. Thank you. I can see you're doing your best, and I appreciate it. The airline manager shuffled awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the floor. I'll make a report and ensure this doesn't happen again. Martin looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. Good. But remember this. True leadership isn't about wielding authority. It's about treating people with respect, no matter who they are or where they sit. The manager nodded quickly, his embarrassment complete. He mumbled an apology once more, before retreating to the galley, his head down. As the plane began its descent, the passengers around Martin offered him words of encouragement and admiration. You handled that with such grace, one woman said. Thank you for standing up to him, another added. That was inspiring to watch. Martin smiled modestly. Sometimes people need a reminder that respect is a two-way street. As the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Martin felt a sense of calm wash over him. He hadn't planned for this confrontation, but he hoped it had left a lasting impression, not just on the manager, but on everyone who had witnessed it. As the plane taxied to the gate, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin felt lighter. The passengers who had watched the confrontation earlier now wore expressions of respect and admiration for Martin. The airline manager remained out of sight, staying in the galley to avoid further embarrassment. The flight attendant approached Martin once more, her tone warm and genuine. Mr. Hayes, we'll be deplaning soon, but before you go, I'd like to extend an invitation from our captain. He'd like to personally thank you for flying with us today. Martin raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the unexpected offer. Well, I'd be honored. Thank you. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Several took a moment to stop by Martin's seat, offering words of appreciation. You handled that with class, said one man, shaking Martin's hand. Another passenger, a young woman, smiled warmly. You've given me a whole new perspective on standing up for yourself. Thank you. Martin nodded graciously at each interaction, humbled by the positive responses. Once most of the passengers had deplaned, the flight attendant returned to escort Martin to the cockpit. Julia, the flight captain, stood waiting, her uniform sharp and her demeanor professional, but friendly. Mr. Hayes, she said, extending her hand, it's an absolute honor to meet you. I've followed your work for years. The improvements you've brought to airport infrastructure have made a huge difference for us in the aviation industry. Martin shook her hand, smiling. Thank you, Captain. That means a lot coming from someone on the front lines of making travel possible. Julia glanced toward the galley, where the airline manager lingered, watching the interaction from a distance. I also heard about what happened earlier. Please know that the behavior you experienced doesn't reflect the values of this airline or our crew. Martin nodded, his tone thoughtful. I understand, Captain. Unfortunately, moments like these are reminders of why respect and understanding should always come first, especially in your industry, where people from all walks of life come together. Julia smiled. Wise words, Mr. Hayes. I can assure you, your message will not go unnoticed. As Martin prepared to leave, Julia presented him with a small token, a gold pin featuring the airline's emblem. This is given to passengers who leave a lasting impression. Thank you for showing us the power of grace under pressure." Martin accepted the pin, nodding appreciatively. "I'll treasure this, Captain, and thank you for the exceptional service today." Passengers from the flight gathered near the gate, recounting the events to curious onlookers. Whispers of admiration for Martin's calm demeanor spread through the crowd. When Martin finally stepped off the plane, a wave of applause erupted from the passengers waiting nearby. Some clapped, others cheered, and a few even approached him for photos. Julia, the captain, walked behind Martin and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we were honored to have Mr. Martin Hayes on board today. His contributions to the aviation industry have made travel better for all of us. Let's show him our gratitude." Martin, ever modest, raised a hand to quiet the applause. "Thank you all, but I'm just one man who believes in the power of respect and hard work. Let's remember to treat one another with kindness. That's what makes all the difference." The crowd cheered once more as Martin made his way toward the baggage claim. Behind him, the airline manager watched from the shadows, his expression a mixture of regret and reflection. For Martin, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about setting an example. And in doing so, he had not only changed the tone of the flight, but left a lasting impression on everyone involved. But there was one final surprise waiting for Martin when he reached the terminal. As Martin walked through the bustling terminal, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The events of the flight had been unexpected, but they had unfolded in a way that left him hopeful. People had seen the importance of respect and kindness, even in the face of prejudice. He approached the baggage claim, where a few passengers from the flight were still waiting. Some waved and smiled, and a young boy ran up to him, tugging his mother behind him. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said shyly. "Are you famous?" Martin crouched down, smiling warmly. "Not exactly. I'm just someone who worked hard and tried to make things better for people." The boy's mother chuckled, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. "He's been talking about you since the announcement on the plane. You've made quite the impression." Martin nodded, standing back up. "Well, if I can inspire him to treat people with kindness, I'd say that's worth more than any title." As he retrieved his luggage and prepared to leave, he heard a hesitant voice behind him. "Mr. Hayes." Turning, Martin saw the airline manager standing a few feet away. The man's posture was stiff, but his expression was one of genuine regret. "Do you have a moment?" the manager asked, his tone quieter and far less defensive than before. Martin studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." The manager stepped closer, taking a deep breath. "I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior on that flight was unacceptable. I made assumptions about you that I had no right to make, and I let my bias cloud my judgment." Martin remained silent, allowing the man to continue. "I've been reflecting on what you said," the manager added, his voice trembling slightly. "About respect and leadership. You were right. I was so focused on enforcing authority that I forgot what it means to lead with dignity. I'm sorry for the way I treated you." Martin's expression softened. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and it's never too late to learn. I hope this experience helps you see the value in treating everyone with the respect they deserve." The manager nodded, his relief evident. "It has. Thank you for handling everything with such grace." Martin extended his hand, and the manager shook it firmly. "Take this as an opportunity to grow," Martin said. "You have the power to make a difference, not just for passengers, but for your team as well." As the manager walked away, Martin turned to leave, feeling a sense of closure. He had not only stood up for himself, but had also inspired someone to change for the better. Martin arrived at his hotel in New York, settling into his room with a sense of peace. He placed the gold pin from the airline on the desk, next to a framed photo of his late wife. "You always said people would see the best in me no matter what," he murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. Looks like you were right. The city lights outside his window sparkled, a reminder that the world was full of opportunities to make a difference, whether in big ways or small. For Martin, this trip wasn't just about travel. It was about reminding himself and others that dignity and kindness could transform even the most challenging situations. If this story inspired you, let us know in the comments. What part moved you the most? Don't forget to share it with someone who could use a reminder that respect and understanding can change the world, one moment at a time. Until next time, take care and remember, it's never too late to lead with kindness.